Good evening. It's good to be here with you for this last evening of our gospel meeting. We're so thankful that you're here. I see some new faces in the audience here tonight, and glad that you're here. Someone's invited you to be here. Be thankful for that person. They care about you. They care about spiritual things. They care about your soul, and it's good to have friends like that. There's a lot of places that people get invited on a Friday night aren't necessarily good for us, physically or spiritually. And so you're in a good place tonight. You're among people that I can tell you after a week of being with them are good people who care about you, who love the Lord, who want the best for you. And so if you'll continue to get to know these people, I'm sure you'll be thankful that you did so. You'll find a family of loving brothers and sisters who just want to go to heaven and think about spiritual things. And that's what we want to do here tonight as we consider our last lesson of this gospel meeting. I'm going to have a few remarks after the lesson, after the invitation song, but before we close. So I'll save some of those for later. But let's go ahead and get into our lesson here tonight. We've been thinking about examples for our instruction this week. We've been looking at Old Testament examples that can teach us just a variety of lessons. And I've just tried to hit on a whole lot of different topics this week that hopefully have been helpful to some of you in some way, perhaps some lessons more than others, just depending on who you are and your situation. But tonight, I want to think with you about an individual I think it's bypassed every once in a while. And the reason why is because he's good buddies with this guy named Joshua. And everybody likes to talk about Joshua in Scripture. You know, there's even a book of the Bible named Joshua. I like Joshua and preach about Joshua. That's my name after all. But there's somebody named Caleb who works alongside Joshua that I want to spend some time thinking about with you here tonight. Look at Numbers chapter 14 with me. Numbers chapter 14. We actually took a look at this text yesterday as we were thinking about discouragement and depression. And we talked about how Moses and Aaron got very discouraged and very depressed and distressed because the congregation had rejected God's plan for them to enter into the promised land. And in Numbers chapter 14, they got extremely discouraged because the people of Israel had begun to rebel against their leader. But there were two individuals, adult individuals, two of the spies out of the 12 who did not rebel against Moses and Aaron, who had quite the opposite attitude, who rebelled against the rebels, who wanted to actually enter into the promised land. They were not afraid to do so, who said that if God has led us to it, then he's going to get us through it. And so we should go. They had an optimistic attitude as they approached that, but their optimistic attitude could not reverse the course of the murmurers and the complainers who were in the camp of Israel. And those two individuals were Joshua and Caleb. If you look at Numbers chapter 14 and verse 24, I want you to see something that God says about Caleb. That is a tremendous compliment. God says in verse 24, but as he is cursing all of the adults who rebelled against Moses and Aaron to stay in the wilderness, to not be allowed to enter into the promised land, he says there's something different about Caleb, though. He says, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. That's a powerful compliment. You know, we may not always think it is good to be different, right? Sometimes that can be used as an insult to say that you're kind of different. We tend to like to conform. We tend to like to fit in and be like everybody else. But God commends Caleb because he has a different spirit in him. You know, I think it's good for us to have a different spirit. I think that's not something you just find in the Old Testament. I think it's something we find in characters in the New Testament. One such example is Apollos in Acts chapter 18 and verse 25. One of the things that is said about mighty Apollos, who is a great orator and a speaker, who was a preacher of the gospel in the early days of the gospel being spread, it says, this man, Apollos, had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord. He had a different spirit. He was fervent in spirit. He was on fire preaching God's word. In fact, Romans chapter 12 says to all Christians that we all need to be fervent in spirit. It's not good for us to be lukewarm, to have just a hum-ho attitude towards the gospel and towards spiritual things. We want people, God wants people who are on fire for Him. Romans chapter 12 and verse 11 says, don't be lagging in diligence. Why do you think he has to say that? Because sometimes we do lag in diligence. Sometimes we're lazy. Sometimes we go through these ruts where we're not really doing anything when it comes to spiritual things. He says, don't lag in diligence, but the opposite of that is be fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. And so we're told to be fervent in spirit. Apollos is commended because he was fervent in spirit. And here we find Caleb in the Old Testament who had a different spirit. Clearly he was fervent in spirit. And so I want to think with you tonight about what were some of the attributes which made Caleb different. What were some of the attributes that made him different? So let's take a look at the text and see what we can learn from this character all by himself. And we're going to give him our full and undivided attention. So, simple question, what made Caleb different? Well, here's the first thing that I would note with you. And that is that Caleb was willing to take a risk for God. When you read Numbers chapter 13, that's where we are introduced to Caleb. And we find that in Numbers 13, Moses, at the command of God, is sending out 12 spies from Israel to go do reconnaissance work in the promised land. And so Numbers 13 is really all about that. We're not going to read Numbers 13. There's a lot of people. It mentions the tribes that they're from in certain sections. But the simple mission was this in verse 2, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. So God says, I'm giving this to you. Okay, but I want you to send some people beforehand from each tribe, everyone a leader among them. I want you to send them into Canaan's land. So in verse 17, Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and he tells them where to go. He tells them what their mission is. He says in verse 19, find out whether the land that they dwell in is good or bad. Is this a good place? Is God sending us to a good place and sending us to the promised land? Find out whether the cities they inhabit are like camps or strongholds. Are there fortresses there, or are there tents? What's it going to be like when we have to go conquer this place? Find out whether the land is rich or poor. What kind of land are we inheriting when we come here? Are there forests there, or are there not? Should we send in the Air Force, or should we send in the Navy, right? Should we send in the Marines, or obviously they didn't send in the Air Force, okay? But how should we attack it? That's the point of it. Are there mountains? Is there water? Is there dense forest? How should we handle this? And in verse 20, he says something that tells us that these people who would be entering this land are taking a risk by doing so. He says, be of good courage. Be of good courage. You know, it can be scary to go to a new place that you have never been. Before this week, I've never been to Wellsburg, West Virginia. That's kind of scary here in some places. And so if you've never been here and you don't know the town, you don't know the city, I mean, it'd be scary for me to go take a hike somewhere up on a mountain in the middle of a dense forest. I'd get lost and stranded and eaten by a mountaineer or something. Scary to go in certain towns and neighborhoods where you don't really know what that town or neighborhood is like. It could be dangerous. There could be people there who want to rob you, want to attack you. It can be scary to go to a new place. My kids this year went to a new school. We just moved to a new state. Second time they've had to go to a new school in 4 years. And I can tell you the stomachs get tied up in knots the first day of school and then the first week of school because you're having to make new friends and meet new people and they don't know you and you don't know them. It's tough. It can be tough. Likewise, when you become a follower of God, you may have to do new things in new ways as we learn to walk with Christ. And that can be scary for some people. Scary for some people who have always just fit in, who have always just done what the rest of the crowd does, who have always just seen what the world does and just imitated it. It's scary sometimes to say, you know what? I've made the decision to start living like Christ, and I can't do that anymore. This is what I'm going to do now. That can be difficult for some people when you're learning that. I went and studied with a man in prison one time several years ago, and he had taken a Bible correspondence course with another preacher. He got moved from his local jail to a prison where he was there for about a year. And when I went and studied with him, he was talking about his time in prison and how before he had gotten into prison, he was just constantly drinking, constantly doing things that were ungodly, and he was trying to change his life over. And he said, well, I was out there in the prison yard, Josh. He said it was the first time that I'd ever played horseshoes without a beer in the other hand. It's different. And he said, I'm going to have to spend the rest of my life when I get out of here playing horseshoes without a beer in my hand. Let me tell you, when you've lived with that your whole life, that's just been the culture you've been a part of. That's what you've always been accustomed to. It's different when you start taking a stand to be different. By the way, my parents hired that individual. I found him a job with their company, and he still works there to this day. He's worked there for over a decade. He's been trying to walk that straight and narrow for a long time. But it's scary sometimes, and we have to take risks when we stand for God. We admire, though, men and women of faith who must take risks in order to fulfill God's unique role for them as they live out their faith. Abraham had to leave Ur of the Chaldees to enter into the place that God was going to show him. Joseph had to deny Potiphar's wife, knowing that perhaps that would get him into trouble because she falsely accused him after he did so. Ruth cared for Naomi, and in caring for Naomi, she had to leave where she was accustomed to living, where she'd always grown up, and move to an entirely new place. I've heard stories already this week of people who have had parents or grandparents or relatives who have needed cared for, and they have left where they live, and they've gone to entirely new states to care for them. Let me tell you, that's scary when you've never done that before. But you do it because you know your family, and family needs to care for family, and you help them out. Daniel prays, even when it's illegal to do so, knowing that by praying, he may very well get arrested because he was praying, and it was against the law. Esther, who we studied in our first lesson this week, she makes request of the king, knowing that by making that request, the king very well could have denied it, and she could have gotten herself in trouble like the previous queen before her. The disciples, Jesus calls them, and they drop their nets, and they say, we're going to quit our jobs, and we're going to follow you. It's scary when you start making decisions like that and taking risks. But you know, the people who just do what is comfortable to fit in with the status quo may save their lives here. But if you want to make a difference, like Caleb, sometimes you need to take a risk to do God's will. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 38 and 39, here's what Jesus says. He knows that following him comes with a risk, that there will be people who hate you because of what you believe. There will be people who persecute you because of what you stand for, because of how you live. There will be people who don't like what you preach and rebel against it. But Jesus says, he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. You know, the cross isn't a happy thing. We wear it around our necks, and we hang it from our ears, and we put it on our walls like it's something that's beautiful. It is awesome. But it's not really a pretty idea. Jesus, when he carried his cross, was headed towards torture. He was headed towards humiliation, and he was headed for death. And when he calls us to take up our cross, that's not a pretty thing. It's realizing that we must make sacrifices. We may be persecuted. We may be tortured, humiliated. We may suffer because of taking our stand with Jesus. But he says, he who does not take his cross and follow after me, you're not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it. You just want to do what the rest of the status quo is because you're trying to fit in? Well, you're not ready to follow Jesus then. You're just not. If you're not willing to be different and take a stand, then you're not ready to follow him. If you find your life, you're going to lose it. But if you'll lose your life, if you will empty yourself of all pride, of all personal preferences, and you will begin to truly follow Jesus no matter where he leads you, he who loses his life will find it. Then you will have hope. You got to take risks to follow Jesus. The second thing that we learn from Caleb, though, is that he spoke out against the majority. He was willing to speak out against the majority. So look at Numbers chapter 13, verses 31 through 33. And in verse 31, it says, let's back up to verse 30 actually. Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." Caleb has a very positive attitude about this. If God has told us to go, then we should go. But then in verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Antioch came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." Notice in verse 30 of chapter 14 that Caleb is willing to speak up even though the rest of the men bring a pessimistic report and choose to reject God's orders. We can either be pessimists who say negative things every time some type of work is done for the Lord, who always kind of talk it down, who have a defeatist attitude, or we can be people who are optimists, who say that if God has told us to do this in this way, then surely he will bless us if we do what he's telling us to do. And I'll tell you, the difference between a successful and an unsuccessful congregation has a lot to do with whether or not you have enough optimists or whether or not you have too many pessimists in the congregation. If you've got people who have a go-getter attitude, people who have this attitude that we're going to be fervent in spirit, we're going to be zealous to do what the Lord calls us to do, when you have enough people who are willing to do that, who are willing to speak up against the majority and stand for what's right, then you'll be successful. Caleb was that person. Unfortunately, though, there were too many pessimists. And the complaining of the congregation is contagious. And only Joshua and Caleb, and by the way, complaining is contagious. You ever sat with somebody who's just complaining all the time, and then you feel like, well, now I feel like I need to offer a complaint. It's contagious. But, optimism can be contagious too. People who have a positive spirit and an upbeat attitude, that can be contagious. I'd rather be that person. And I think God would rather us be that person. The complaining is contagious, and only Joshua and Caleb are willing to stand against the backsliding wilderness rejects. Look at Numbers chapter 14 and verse 6. It says in verse 6 of Numbers 14, "Joshua the son of Nun, Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, they tore their clothes." They can't believe it. God told us that he's going to give us the land, people. So why are you being so negative? And in verse 7, they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, 2 people against an entire congregation of thousands of people, standing up and being optimistic. And they said, "The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. And if the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them. The Lord is with us. Don't fear them." That was what Joshua and Caleb said. You know what the rest of the congregation wanted to do? Verse 10. The congregation said, "Stone them with stones." That's what you get for being optimistic sometimes. You want to stand up and do things different, make a difference for God, do his will, sometimes people will start throwing stones at you. One thing I know for sure when it comes to the work that a church does and that we do is that if we continue to do nothing, that's going to be the results. I appreciate people who say, "You know what, let's try this." few years ago, I was living in a little town about 15 minutes away from where I was preaching. And I've really almost always lived about 15 minutes or so from where I was preaching, the building. And one of the things we started doing is I started noticing that when I invite people to come 15 minutes, sometimes they're not willing to drive 15, 20 minutes. So I said, why don't we got this nice little community center. I was on the park board at the time, and so I had access to the community center. I said, why don't we just use this community center? Let's go knock on every door that we can, send out flyers to everybody that we can, and just invite people to come. Well, there was some people thought that was a good idea, but they thought, well, I don't know if we can handle that. It might be too much. There was kind of some negative. Why can't we just have it in our building? Look. Every time we'd had a gospel meeting up to that point, in terms of people from the community, that's what I'm talking about. We'd had like maybe 2, 3, 4 visitors. 2 lessons on a Friday and Saturday night, working hard the entire week before. We had 36 visitors from the community. We tried something different. We did something different. There was nothing unscriptural. You don't have to preach the gospel in one particular building. We tried something different, and it was successful. Did the same thing. We had a creation seminar. Brought in someone who was teaching creation from what I would call a biblical standpoint, responding to arguments for macroevolution. But we brought him, and he's a gospel preacher as well, and we rented out a school. We said, let's have it at a school. Oh, that's going to cost a lot of money, which it did. It was an expensive endeavor. We're now school. We sent out flyers all over the place. 100 visitors from the community. We had that same guy, by the way, 3 years before, and we had about 10, which is pretty good compared to what a lot of times we had. 100 visitors from the community. It was too much to even follow up on. There were so many. It also created conversations. Some of the college professors, we had it right across the street from a university. Some of the college professors were writing in the newspaper about it. We were able to have some back and forth conversation. Some people didn't want to do that, but let me tell you, whenever we've tried and whenever I've tried to sometimes just kind of get out of the comfort zone a little bit, do something a little bit different, God's blessed it. God's blessed it. Now, we got to do things in a scriptural way. Some people take that a little too far. They start doing things in an unscriptural way. But preaching the gospel is scriptural any time of the day, no matter where you're doing it. These two, Joshua and Caleb, were the only 2 people who would enter the promised land. In Numbers chapter 14 and verse 20, notice it. The Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word. He's speaking to Moses here, who was asking for forgiveness for the rebellious people. But truly, as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. And because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. Verse 29. By the way, notice what happens to the people who said, we can't go there because if we go in there, we're going to die. Well, God says, the carcasses of you who have complained against me shall die in this wilderness. The very thing that you were afraid of, that's what's going to happen to you in the wilderness because of your rebellion. And all of you who are numbered, according to your entire number, from 20 years old and above, in verse 30, except for Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun, you shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. He goes on to say. Caleb, despite the fact many people rejected God's will, Caleb was willing to be in the minority and speak out against the majority, even though the majority was rejecting God's will. And listen, we've got to do the same thing in this world. Look at Matthew chapter 7. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7. And the Sermon on the Mount, these 2 small verses, verses 13 and 14, Jesus talks about how sometimes we're going to have to stand in the narrow way. He says, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, broad is the way that leads to destruction. There are many who go in by it, but narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. There are going to be times when you're standing up for the Lord that you're going to feel like you're in the few. You will be in the few, but you still have to make that stand. Be in the minority. What does that mean for us sometimes? Well, you may at some point in time in your office or wherever it is you work, factory, the mill, wherever it is, you may have to be the person who takes a stand there. While everybody else is telling dirty jokes and laughing at dirty jokes and using filthy language, you may have to be the one that says, I'd appreciate it if you didn't talk like that. I've known people who were in offices, who worked in offices with accounting, with money. They had bosses who expected them to cheat, who expected them to be dishonest with money. And they said, you know what, I'm not going to cheat. I'm not going to do that. That's not how I'm going to do it. I can't live with that. They've been fired. I've known people who were fired because they wouldn't cheat. You may have to be the person who takes a stand in the classroom. While everybody else is believing one thing and standing for one thing, you might have to be different. I told Daniel this story earlier this week, but when I was in college, my degree's in English education, and I took methods courses where they kind of teach you how to teach. And when I was in one of those methods courses at my college, our professor brought in two individuals who were a homosexual couple. This was 20 years ago. So if you think this stuff doesn't happen now, I'll tell you it was happening 20 years ago. But brought in a homosexual couple, and the ultimate point of bringing the homosexual couple in was to say that you will have to be accepting of homosexuals who are in your classroom, and you need to approve them in their lifestyle when you're teaching middle school, high school. Well, I'm sitting there thinking, great. I'm going to have to speak up because I just can't let this be said in here. I'm going to have to speak up. And I addressed my professor in front of those two individuals, and I just simply said, you know what? I would never encourage someone to speak hatefully. I would never encourage someone to name call. I believe that's just as wrong as any other sin. I would never allow anything like that in my classroom. But if you are asking me as a Christian who holds to certain moral values to tell someone that I approve of a lifestyle that I believe is sinful, then I believe you're taking things a little too far there. There's a difference between tolerance and approval. I might tolerate something, but that doesn't mean I necessarily approve of it. And she said to me, well then, maybe you don't need to be a teacher. Well, she got her wish. I'm not a teacher. In front of an entire classroom of my peers, after spending, $25,000 of my own money for the education that I was taking in my senior year of college, I was told, you should quit teaching if you don't approve of this. We had a good conversation, by the way, after that. I emailed her and I said, you know what? What you just did was called reverse discrimination. You just discriminated against Christians. The very thing that you're trying to avoid, you just discriminated against me. She came to agree. She apologized, so I don't want to, leave the story making her just look bad. She apologized for what she said, and in the heat of the moment, she said too much. And so we had a good conversation after that. But it's kind of embarrassing right there. Sometimes you might have to stand up and say something in those situations. You may have to be the one in your own home who, when one of your family members is watching a TV show and it's dirty and there's images that are showing up on the screen that you shouldn't be seeing, that are going to get burned and etched into your brain, you might have to be the one who just simply says, you know what, we shouldn't be watching this. We should turn this off. It takes just a little bit of courage to say that, even to your own family sometimes. Or who says, you know what, we really shouldn't be talking about that. Courage doesn't have to be on a big stage. Sometimes it's just the little things we do in our homes You may also have to display a different spirit in the church and say sometimes if things are going too far in an unscriptural direction where you say, you know what, this isn't right. I don't read about this in my Bible. Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 16, I want you to notice what Paul wrote to a New Testament church. He said in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 16, he said, in verse 17, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus. That means by his authority. Whatever we do when it comes to us as individuals or even us in what we do as a church, let's make sure that what we're doing is by the authority of Jesus Christ, that we can back it up in his word. Because I'll tell you, there's a lot of churches doing things that you don't read about in your scriptures. It's gone too far. You may have to be the person who says, we just don't have authority for that, if you want to follow the Lord fully. And so Caleb took a risk for God. He spoke out against the majority. But a third thing that he did is he followed the Lord completely. 6 times in Scripture, and I think it's there in your outline if you have an interactive outline with you. But Numbers 14:24, Numbers 32:12, Deuteronomy 1:36, Joshua chapter 14, verse 8, verse 9, verse 14. 6 times in Scripture, Caleb is described as having followed me fully in his faith. Sometimes when it comes to our faith, we are content to follow God in the areas in which it agrees with our preconceived notions. Others are willing to follow God unless it requires standing against the beliefs of others. In other words, some people only follow God in part, but not in whole. You're not following God, may I suggest, if you're only following him in part. Caleb was different because he followed the Lord fully. Preachers, for example. Preachers, you have to preach the whole counsel of God. And hearers have to be willing to obey it if we're going to be pleasing to God. Acts 20, verse 27, Paul said, I'm not ashamed to preach the gospel of Christ. He said that in Romans 1, but he declares to Ephesus that he hasn't shunned to declare the whole counsel of God. And I'm going to tell you as a preacher, it is easy to skip over what is offensive to our audience. And sometimes because we know some of the people that we worship and we work with, it's easy for us to avoid some hot button issues and topics and to preach what only pleases our audience. Such preaching pleases man, but does not please God. As preachers, on my Facebook page at one point in time, it says, who's your employer? And I put God. It's not actually the local church. They don't tell me what to preach. God does. And everything that I preach and teach needs to be from him. He's the one that calls me to teach his word. One of the greatest compliments of any king of the Old Testament, one of the greatest compliments he might receive is when he followed the Lord and did not depart to the right or to the left. And it was a rare king who did that. It's hard to do because sometimes you just want to please the people. You want to make them happy. Be that person, though, who follows the Lord fully. There's 2 more things I want to share with you, and then the lesson will be yours. One is that his faith did not fizzle as he aged. His faith did not fizzle as he aged. Now look, in Joshua 14 and verse 7, this is right after they've entered into the promised land. We learn there that Caleb was 40 years old. 40 years old when he first went into the promised land and reported back to Moses. You know, I want you to notice, first of all, I know a lot of people who started off as Christians when they were younger. I'm 42. There's a lot of my peers that have already dropped off when it comes to their faith. Their faith's already weakened. It's already fizzled. Some of them have left the faith. Well, Caleb's 40 years old. He's been serving God for quite a while through some difficult circumstances. And his faith is still solid. He's not going through some kind of a midlife crisis, questioning his faith as he ages. Caleb shows the bold leadership that men who are in their 40s ought to be displaying. But even more impressive is this. When you read Joshua chapter 14, at age 86, 46 years later, Caleb at age 86 is ready to enter into the promised land and receive the promises that God had made all those years ago. That's awesome to me. 86 years old and his faith is still strong. You know, it's easy for us to want to slow down and just retire from the Lord as we age. It's easy for us to think, well, you know, I'm older now. I've done my time. Just let the young guys do it. But I don't see Caleb having that kind of an attitude. Caleb still says, you know what? Let's go take this mountain. 86 years old. I'm ready to go fight for it. Caleb is going and pressing forward, securing the Lord's promises. And I'm going to tell you, I'm talking to our older generation who's here today, and those of you who are young, you'll be the older generation someday. But that's how it ought to be as we grow old in the faith. Take a look at some passages. Psalm chapter 92. Psalm chapter 92, and notice verses 12 through 15 of Psalm 92. I love this passage. It says, "The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those who are planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God." Now notice verse 14. "They shall still bear fruit in old age." If you're one of those older people in our audience tonight, are you still bearing fruit for the Lord? They shall still bear fruit in old age. They shall be fresh and flourishing to declare that the Lord is upright. Notice 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and in verse 16. This is a passage that I like to point out, even to people who are shut-ins, who may not be able to come out to services. I've heard shut-ins say to me, you know, I don't know what I can do for the Lord now. I can't even get out of my house. I can't come to worship. And I always tell them, let me tell you something awesome you can do that would really mean a lot to me. You can pray for me. You don't have to be here in the building to do that. You don't have to be able to get out to do that. But man, it would mean so much to me if you would pray, and I need your prayers. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 says this in verse 16. It says, "Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day." You can continue to grow in spirit and in faith in old age. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, the last chapter that Paul probably writes in terms of the inspired word, he says, you know what? I have fought the good fight. I have finished my course, and I am ready to depart. He knew that death was near, and he had continued to serve the Lord from the time that he was converted to the time that he would die. He kept working for him. He didn't just give up at some point. In Titus chapter 2, I think this is one of the most important chapters for congregations. Titus chapter 2. Let me tell you something. When I was younger, the trend, and it's been a trend for a while now, but when I was younger, the trend was to try to get young people around more young people, because if they're around more young people, then maybe that will help them in their faith. And it's great to be around young people. That's good to know other young people like you are serving the Lord. But actually, if that's all that we're doing is putting our young people around other young people, we're doing it wrong. Titus 2 says older men should be teaching younger men. Older women should be teaching younger women. Your young people need to be around some older people who have been there, done that, who are wiser, more experienced, who can share that knowledge. And you older people need to be looking for younger people that you can mentor and help in their faith. Titus 2 commands it. So as you get older, you're needed in the church. Don't let your faith fizzle out. While Caleb is ready to go fight himself, I would make one point. Perhaps he's wise enough that he's going to need some more help now. Because when you read Numbers chapter 13 and verse 6, you read something. Caleb was from the tribe of Judah. And then when you turn to the book of Judges, where he actually goes and he begins taking that land that he had been promised all of those years ago, look at Judges chapter 1 and notice what he does. He says in Judges chapter 1 and verse 9, he says, "Afterward the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who dwelt in the mountain." The children of Judah, that's Caleb's tribe. They went down to fight against the Canaanites, and then Judah went against the Canaanites who dwelt in Hebron, verse 10. Verse 11, then they went against the inhabitants of Debir. And then in verse 12, Caleb said, "Whoever attacks Kirjath-Sepher and takes it, to him I will give my daughter as a wife." And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him his daughter as a wife. So as Judah's driving out the inhabitants, he makes a deal with anybody brave enough to take on Kirjath-Sepher, you can marry my daughter. And Othniel takes it on, and he gets the upper and the lower springs of that mountain. Simple lesson that I want to learn from that is that if we do not encourage the next generation to take their role, we will die out. Caleb's doing that. Maybe he is older. Maybe I don't know if I can take on these people. I'm doing my best, but let's get to the next generation. Build that. Well, last thing that I'll share with you is this. Caleb did as he said he would do. The fonts are different on the screen, so I don't think you can see the last point. But that's what it is. He did as he said he would do. Here's the thing. In Joshua 14, 45 years earlier, Caleb had said, when you read Joshua 14 and verse 12, that he was going to drive out the Anakim. The reason why that's important is because the Anakim were giants. They were very large people. And that's who a lot of the other spies were afraid of. And Caleb said, I'm going to drive them out. You might be afraid of them, but I'm going to do it. These were the same giants the other spies were fearing when you read Numbers 13, 32, and 33. But just as Caleb said he would, look at verses 19 and 20 of Judges chapter 1. It says, so the Lord was with Judah. They drove out the mountaineers. Don't take that out of context, you West Virginia people. Right? But they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland because they had chariots of iron. And they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had said. And then he expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak. He'd promised it 45 years earlier. He delivers on his promise 45 years later. Sometimes when it comes to our faith, we make this confession. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I'm ready to live for him. I'm ready to do whatever he calls me to do. But some people, when it comes to that confession, they're all talk and little action. Jesus would ask you, as he did people in his day in Luke 6:46, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say? Why are you saying I'm your Lord, and there's still things that you're disobeying? One of the things that he condemned the Pharisees for in Matthew chapter 23, as he says, look, they say a lot of things that maybe you should listen to, but they say and do not, so don't follow their example. Look, if you're going to claim to be a Christian, don't go out there living like a hypocrite and giving Christians a bad name. If you're going to live as a follower of Jesus Christ, then truly and sincerely follow him with all of your heart and soul. Live for him, or your claim is false. Caleb did as he said he would do. He practiced what he preached. He walked the talk. He did tough things. I do want to remind you that there may be times that we are sincerely trying to live as Christians, and there may be times that we fall. I'm not saying there's not an avenue of forgiveness, but it seems like some people sometimes just constantly trample upon the Son of God by continuing to live in sin. They've been told time and time again, they don't fix it. If you're going to live as a Christian, then mean it if you're going to follow Jesus. Caleb said, this is what I'm going to do. It may take me 45 years to get to it, but when he had the opportunity, he did it. He followed through. So in what ways can you learn from Caleb? I think we need more people like Caleb in our families, in our churches, in our nation. If you're willing to take risks, you're going to be of a different spirit than those who are contented with the safety of the world. If you're willing to speak out against the majority, you will be of a different spirit than those who are just crowd pleasers. If you follow the Lord completely, you will be of a far different spirit than those who are just fair weather Christians, kind of following the Lord when it's convenient or popular to do so. And if your faith remains strong as you age, you will have a different spirit than those who allow the trials and the tribulations of life to soften our spine and sometimes weaken our spiritual stamina. And if you will do as you say in following Jesus, then you're going to be of a far different spirit than those who are Christians in name only, but not in deed. And so I challenge you just tonight as you think about this lesson, as we bring it to a close, will you dare to be different will you be a modern day Caleb and be optimistic and confident in an age of doubt and amidst the growing tide of spiritual pessimism? The descendants of Caleb, look at 1 Samuel 25 and verse 3. I haven't said the last verse yet, like I have the past couple of nights. Look at 1 Samuel 25 and verse 3. But I'm almost there. Do you notice what the descendants of Caleb are called in this passage? Verse 3 says, the name of the man was Nabal, his wife was Abigail. She was a woman of good understanding, beautiful appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb. Some versions actually say Calebite. He was a Calebite. In some sense, we need to be a Calebite too. But not a Calebite, a Christian. These people took the name of Caleb. They were his descendants. They were from his family. When we become Christians, we take the name of Jesus Christ. We become a part of his family, of his household. And so in Acts chapter 17 and verse 11, it talks about the disciples in Antioch. They were first called Christians in Antioch. Christian is simply a follower of Jesus Christ, someone who is a part of his family, someone who has been born again. But we're not just a family when it comes to blood, physical, fleshly relation. We're part of his family because we've chosen to imbibe his character and his spirit and what he stood for in our lives. Tonight, we would ask you, if you're not a Christian, are you ready to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus? In Numbers chapter 14, one of the things that God said about the people who would be cursed in the wilderness is one of the reasons they would be cursed in verse 22 is because all these men have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and they have put me to the test now these 10 times and have not heeded my voice, and therefore I'm going to reject them. There may be some of you here, maybe you've sat through these lessons, you've listened to these invitations, you're still not living right, you still haven't obeyed him. I want you to understand something, that there is fantastic evidence to believe in Jesus. Jesus fulfilled prophecy by his coming to earth. He was born of a virgin. That's a prophecy that he fulfilled. There are over 300 prophecies that apply to Jesus. Jesus performed miracles while he was here on earth. Those were signs to prove that he was from God. That was the conclusion Nicodemus came to. We know that you're a teacher come from God. How would you be able to do these signs if you weren't from God? And so we know about his walking on water, his making the blind people see, the deaf people hear, causing the widow's son to live. Jesus did all those things as proofs to us of who he is. We know Jesus died, and 3 days later he rose from the dead. What's the point of those miracles? The point of those miracles is they are signs so that you might be convicted that the glory of God came to earth, lived among us in human flesh, and did so that you could be saved through him. If you know these things, then why would you reject it? It's amazing to me when I think of the people who rejected Moses. You saw 10 consecutive plagues that were performed upon Israel, and you still rejected God? You saw waters literally divide so that you could cross on dry land through the Red Sea, and you still rejected God? You've been fed by manna. The soles of your shoes didn't wear out. Your clothes didn't wear out. All of those things were miraculous signs so that you might believe in God. And you still, when God says, go into the land, you still rejected him? How could you do so? And sometimes I ask the same question. When there's so much evidence for how and why we should believe Jesus, Son of God, why would you reject him? He has given you so much proof so you can believe who he is. I would just invite you to do the same thing that Caleb did. He's given you an inheritance. He's made precious promises to you that you can be in heaven with him. You can have a great inheritance. We can be there for all of eternity. This is not heaven. You got to be kidding me if you think this earth is heaven. This earth is cursed. It is broken. It is sinful. I want out of this place. How do you get out? Who's your ticket out? It's Jesus who's overcome death and now lives for all of eternity. And so go take this mountain. Don't wait any longer. Whatever trials and sacrifices you have to face here and now, it is worth it. Because he's going to bless you with such a fantastic inheritance. You're never going to regret it when you get there. And so I'd encourage you, if you haven't made that decision yet, won't you make it? Won't you come? If you want to come now, while we stand and while we sing.